The dashboard was soft. Betty Cash pressed her palm into the vinyl, and her fingers sank in. The heat from outside had turned the car's interior into an oven. Behind her, 7-year-old Colby Landrum was screaming. His grandmother, Vickie, had one arm around him and her eyes fixed on the thing in the road. It was the size of a water tower. A diamond of dull silver metal, ringed with small blue lights, hung at treetop level. Every few seconds, flames blasted out from the flat bottom, flaring downward in a cone of fire. When the flames died back, the craft sank a few feet lower. When they roared again, it rose. Betty was still outside the car. She had stepped out into the dark pine woods of East Texas to get a better look. The night was December 29, 1980. The road was Farm to Market Road, 1485, a narrow 2-lane strip through dense forest between the towns of New Caney and Dayton. The sky had been clear and cold. The air smelled of pine sap and wet asphalt. A light rain had fallen earlier that evening, and the dirt shoulders of the road were still soft. Betty, Vickie, and Colby had just eaten dinner at a restaurant in nearby Cleveland and were headed home. Betty was 51 years old. She managed a restaurant and lived alone in a small house in Dayton. She was divorced, independent, and not easily frightened. Her friends described her as tough. She had raised children, worked long hours, and handled the kind of daily problems that don't make the newspapers. Vickie Landrum, 57, sat in the passenger seat. She was a born-again Christian who read her Bible daily and prayed before every meal. Colby, Vickie's grandson, was in the back. He was a quiet child who loved his grandmother and was afraid of the dark. They were 3 people on an ordinary road on an ordinary night. And ordinary was about to end. The pine woods of East Texas are thick and dark even in daylight. At night, the canopy swallows the stars. Betty knew this stretch well. She had driven it for years. But on this night, the familiar road felt different. The pines stood too still. The air outside the windows seemed to hum. Betty drove carefully that night because the rain had left patches of standing water on the pavement, and because Vickie had mentioned that Colby was getting carsick. None of them had any reason to think the night would be anything other than ordinary. At first, they thought it was an airplane. Houston Intercontinental Airport was only about 35 miles away, and planes crossed this sky all the time. The lights of incoming jets were a familiar sight above the pine canopy. But this light grew brighter, and it did not move like a plane. It descended. It came toward the road. It made no sound except for the periodic roar of flames. Vickie told Betty to stop. The heat was already pressing against the windshield. The glass was warm to the touch. Inside the car, the temperature had risen enough to make breathing feel strange, as though the air itself had changed weight. Vickie was a born-again Christian, and in that moment she believed she was seeing the second coming. She turned to Colby and told him, "That's Jesus. He will not hurt us." Betty did not share that certainty. She was afraid, and she considered turning the car around. But the road was narrow. The dirt shoulders were soft from rain that evening, and she was afraid of getting stuck in the mud with that thing behind them. So she stopped the car, and she opened the door, and she stepped out into the night. The object hovered perhaps 100 feet away. It was intensely bright in a dull metallic silver, shaped like a huge upright diamond, with the top and bottom cut flat. Small blue lights ringed the center. periodically, flames shot out of the bottom, flaring outward, creating the effect of a large cone. Every time the fire dissipated, the craft floated downward toward the road. When the flames blasted out again, it rose back up. The heat was strong enough to make the car's metal body painful to the touch. Betty later said she had to wrap her coat around her hand to protect herself from the door handle when she climbed back inside. Vickie claimed that when she touched the dashboard, her hand pressed into the softened vinyl, leaving an imprint that was still visible weeks later. Vickie had gotten out briefly, but returned to the car to comfort Colby. The boy was terrified. He kept screaming that the sky was on fire. Vickie held him and prayed while Betty stood outside, staring at the craft. The encounter lasted about 20 minutes. Then the object began to ascend over the treetops, rising higher into the night sky. And from the darkness, they heard the thumping of rotors. Helicopters. Many of them. Cash and Landrum counted 23. The aircraft were tandem rotor Boeing CH-47 Chinooks, the kind used by militaries worldwide. They approached the diamond in tight formation, surrounding it. Cash later claimed that at least some of the helicopters had United States Air Force markings on the side, spelled out in full. With the road now clear, Betty drove on. She said she caught glimpses of the object and the helicopters receding into the distance, moving together as a group. They were three ordinary people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. The military was already there. The government knew. And in the hours that followed, their bodies would begin to tell a story that the United States of America would spend years trying to ignore.
This is Tom Mackenzie, and you are listening to Unexplained History. Tonight, we're going down a road in East Texas, where three people stopped for something in the trees. What they saw didn't just frighten them, it marked them. Burns, hair loss, hospital beds, and a lawsuit that reached the United States government. By the end, one woman was dead on the exact anniversary of the night the sky opened. The question isn't whether they saw something. The question is what the government was willing to admit. And why, when three ordinary people asked for help, the only person who seemed to listen was a man who already believed in flying saucers.
The Chinooks came out of the north. Betty Cash would remember the sound for the rest of her life. The deep rhythmic thump of twin rotors, multiplied by 23 aircraft, filled the pine woods like a mechanical heartbeat. She was still driving, her hands tight on the wheel, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Colby had finally stopped screaming, but he was shaking. Vickie turned around to watch through the rear window. The diamond-shaped craft was higher now above the treetops, and the helicopters had formed a loose ring around it. Some were ahead, some behind, some to the sides. It looked, she would later say, like an escort or a guard. The CH-47 Chinook is one of the most recognizable military helicopters in the world. It has two rotors, one at the front and one at the rear, mounted on a long fuselage. It is not a small machine. In 1980, the United States Army used them by the hundreds. The Air National Guard used them. But the United States Air Force did not operate Chinooks. Betty Cash was adamant about what she had seen. During a formal interview 8 months later at Bergstrom Air Force Base, she told a United States Air Force captain that the helicopters had United States Air Force written on the side in full words. She was specific. She was calm. She was certain. That certainty would become a cornerstone of the case. Betty drove the Landrums home to Dayton. The ride was quiet. The only sound was the tires on the pavement and Colby's occasional whimper. Vickie kept looking back through the rear window, but the sky was empty now, just stars and clouds and the dark outline of the pine trees. Whatever had been there was gone. Betty dropped them at Vickie's house. She said goodnight, got back in the car, and drove to her own home. Her hands ached from gripping the wheel. Her face felt tight, as though she had spent too long in the sun. When she finally pulled into her own driveway, she sat in the car for several minutes before going inside. The house was dark. Her cat was waiting by the door. She tried to eat something, but the smell of food made her nauseous. She went to bed around midnight and woke up 2 hours later vomiting into a wastebasket. She was not alone. When she called Vickie the next morning, both women had spent the night vomiting. Their eyes burned. Their skin felt as though they had been sunburned. Colby was sick too, though not as severely. He complained that his eyes hurt and that he felt dizzy. They did not go to the doctor immediately. They assumed it would pass. But it did not pass. Over the following days, Betty's condition worsened dramatically. Large, painful blisters formed on her skin. Patches of her scalp began to peel. She felt weakness in her limbs that made it difficult to stand. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who appeared to have been exposed to something no doctor could name. Vickie Landrum suffered too. She reported lingering weakness, skin sores, and a burning sensation in her eyes that would not go away. Her grandson Colby, the youngest witness, was traumatized. For months, he refused to sleep alone. He would wake up screaming that the sky was on fire. He drew pictures of the diamond and the helicopters during school, so many that his teacher called home to ask if everything was all right. He told his teachers that Jesus had come down from the sky, and the army had been there to meet him. In April of 1981, something happened that seemed to confirm the entire story. ACH-47 helicopter landed in Dayton. Colby saw it from his window and began to cry. Vickie, hoping to calm his fears, took him to the landing zone. She told the pilot that she had been one of the people burned by the UFO. According to Vickie, the pilot replied that he had been in the area before, checking on a UFO in trouble near Huffman. Then he stopped talking, hustled them out of the aircraft, and would not speak to them again. It felt like confirmation. A military pilot had admitted it. The government knew, but confirmation, in this case, would prove to be a slippery thing. The pilot was not talking about December of 1980. He was referring to an incident 3 years earlier, in 1977. The words sounded right, but the calendar was wrong. Still, in the spring of 1981, Vickie Landrum did not know that. She only knew that a man in uniform had said something he should not have said, and then he had clammed up. To her, the cover-up was already underway. By January of 1981, Betty Cash could not walk. The woman who had stepped out of her car to face a burning diamond in the East Texas woods was now unable to stand without help. Her face was swollen and sunburned. Her hair was coming out in clumps that she collected from her pillow each morning. Her fingernails loosened and fell away. She was nauseated, weak, and in pain that medication barely touched. On January 3rd, she checked into a hospital emergency room. The doctors were alarmed. Her skin was blistered across her face and arms, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely open them. The emergency room physician noted symptoms consistent with severe sunburn or flash burns, but Betty insisted she had not been near any fire. She told them about the object on Farm to Market Road, 1485. The doctors listened politely and ordered blood work. The blood work came back with abnormalities that no one could explain. Her white blood cell count was elevated. Her electrolytes were off. She was dehydrated despite drinking water constantly. The admitting physician wrote in his notes that Betty Cash presented with symptoms suggestive of radiation exposure, though he admitted he had never seen a case of acute radiation sickness in his career. He transferred her to a larger hospital in Houston for further evaluation. Doctors initially treated her for burns with intravenous fluids and topical creams. Then, according to her own account, they switched to treating her for radiation sickness. She was transferred between hospitals. Specialists were consulted. Her symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, burning eyes, skin damage, and patches of missing hair, resembled acute radiation exposure to physicians who had never seen a case firsthand. In a 1985 HBO documentary called UFOs, What's Going On? Betty Cash appeared on camera. The program showed photographs of her bald patches. She described the weeks of treatment, the creams that did nothing, the questions from doctors who stared at her chart as though it were written in another language. She told the interviewer that her doctors believed she had been exposed to something that should not exist on a dark country road. The Landrums fared somewhat better, but they did not fare well. Vickie developed a cataract in one eye that April, a condition she had not shown before the encounter. She reported skin sores, persistent weakness, and hair loss that she would only begin to describe months later. Colby continued to suffer from nightmares and a fear of the sky that would follow him into adulthood. The physical damage became the case's anchor. In the world of UFO research, most sightings are lights in the sky. Most witnesses walk away unchanged. But Betty Cash had lost her hair. She had lost her fingernails. She had spent nearly a month in a hospital bed. The dashboard of her Oldsmobile still bore, she claimed, the impression of Vickie's hand from the heat. This was not a story about ambiguous lights. This was a story about bodily harm. And bodily harm, in the logic of the believers, meant something real had been there. Something with mass. Something with heat. Something that the United States military had arrived to collect, or control, or conceal. In February of 1981, local newspapers began to cover the story. A reporter from the Conroe Courier interviewed the women. Their photograph appeared beside headlines about a UFO encounter in the piney woods. The story was strange, local, and sensational. It did not stay local for long. Vickie Landrum began making phone calls. She called military bases. She called her senators. She called NASA. She was a grandmother from Dayton, Texas, with a 7th grade education and the burning certainty that the government had harmed her family and was refusing to admit it. When she called NASA, the operator did not know what to do with her. So the operator transferred her to a man who did. His name was John Schuessler. He was an aerospace engineer who worked for a contractor at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. He was also a lifelong believer in extraterrestrial visitation and a member of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. When Vickie's call came through, Schuessler was not just willing to listen. He was eager. He would become the architect of everything that followed.
This is Tom Mackenzie, and you are listening to Unexplained History. When a grandmother from East Texas calls NASA and the government actually hands her to someone who cares, you have to wonder if the system worked exactly backward from how it was designed. John Schuessler didn't just document the Cash-Landrum case. He became its champion, its publicist, and eventually its gatekeeper. He collected medical records, interviewed witnesses, and built a file that would eventually fill a book. But he also made choices about what to share and what to bury. And those choices would shape the story for decades. In the beginning, though, he was simply the only person in the government who seemed to believe that something had happened on that road. And belief, once it finds an audience, can move faster than fact. Sometimes the person who listens is not the person who should.
John Schuessler was 52 years old in 1981. He had degrees in engineering and a resume that included work for NASA. He had also spent decades studying UFOs. When Vickie Landrum described the diamond, the flames, the helicopters, and the sickness, Schuessler did not express doubt. He expressed interest. Within weeks of Vickie's phone call, Schuessler had visited Dayton 3 times. He interviewed the witnesses. He photographed Betty's car. He measured the softened dashboard. He examined Vickie's eyes with a flashlight. He took soil samples from the side of Farm to Market Road, 1485, and sent them to a private laboratory for analysis. He used a Geiger counter to check for radiation and reported finding none. He began compiling what would become a file several inches thick, complete with medical records, interview transcripts, and photographs of the witnesses' injuries. But Schuessler was not a neutral archivist. He was a committed advocate for the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And in his eyes, this was not just a sighting. To him, it proved the government knew. It proved the technology was real. And it proved 3 ordinary witnesses had stumbled into something the military wanted hidden. In the summer of 1981, Vickie and Betty's calls to government offices began to produce results of a kind. United States Senators Lloyd Bentsen and John Tower, both Texans, replied to their letters. The senators did not confirm a UFO encounter, but they advised the women to contact the Judge Advocate Claims Office at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin. They suggested that if the women had been harmed by a military operation, they should file a claim for damages. Betty flew back to Texas from Alabama, where she had moved after the incident. On August 17, 1981, she, Vickie, and Colby drove to Austin. They were going to meet the government face to face. The interview at Bergstrom lasted hours. They sat across from United States Air Force personnel and told their story again. They described the diamond. They described the heat. They described the helicopters. They described the words United States Air Force on the sides of the Chinooks. They answered every question. At the end of the interview, the Air Force officers told them something that would shape the rest of their lives. The Air Force, they said, no longer investigated UFO cases. There was nothing the Air Force could do beyond providing them with damage claim forms. The women were profoundly disappointed. They had come hoping for answers. They left with paperwork. But the paperwork was a door, and Peter Gersten was the man who would kick it open. Gersten was an attorney based in Arizona. He had a reputation for taking unusual cases, and he agreed to represent Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum pro bono. In 1982, he filed a lawsuit against the United States federal government for $20 million. The suit alleged that the government had conducted a dangerous aerial operation using an experimental craft and a fleet of military helicopters, and that this operation had caused severe physical and emotional harm to 3 civilians. The case would drag through the federal courts for 4 years. Testimony was gathered from officials at NASA, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. The government denied everything. There was no diamond-shaped craft, they said. There were no military helicopters in the area that night. No branch of the armed forces had conducted any operation matching the witness's description. The women were not deterred. They had been on that road. They had felt the heat. They had counted the helicopters. And they were certain, beyond any doubt, that the government was lying. While John Schessler was preparing to present the Cash-Landrum case at a Center for UFO Studies symposium in September of 1981, another investigation was unfolding in the Piney Woods. And this one was not run by a UFO believer. It was run by the state of Texas. State Representative Larry Browder, a Democrat from Cold Spring, had been alarmed by the women's visit to his office. He asked the Texas Department of Health's Bureau of Radiation Control to look into the incident. On September 16, 1981, Russ Meyer, a regional inspector for the Bureau, drove a 10-mile stretch of Farm-to-Market Road 1485 between Huffman and New Caney with radiation detection equipment. He found nothing. Meyer was not an amateur. He was a trained radiation safety inspector with years of experience monitoring industrial sites and medical facilities across southeast Texas. His equipment included a gamma scintillation detector and a Geiger counter, both calibrated and certified. He drove the road slowly, stopping every half mile to take readings. He checked the drainage ditches. He checked the tree line. He checked the soil where the women claimed the object had hovered. The needles on his instruments never moved beyond background levels. He collected soil samples from 5 locations and sent them to the state laboratory in Austin for spectrographic analysis. The results came back 2 weeks later. No abnormal isotopes, no elevated radioactivity, no chemical contaminants. The road was clean. The dirt was ordinary East Texas clay. The pine needles were just pine needles. Meyer did not dismiss the women. In fact, he told reporters, "I have no doubt those women saw something," but he could not verify radiation exposure. So he made the witnesses an offer. He asked to examine their medical records. The state health department's medical advisory board could review the files and determine whether the symptoms were caused by radiation, chemical toxins, or something else entirely. It was a reasonable offer. It was a scientific offer, and according to the records that would later be uncovered by researcher Kurt Collins, John Schessler either refused or simply ignored it. The Texas Department of Health file, labeled Complaint C-12, contained more than radiation readings. It also contained a memo from Meyer documenting a meeting with Schessler on September 10, 1981. During that meeting, Schessler provided an overview of the incident and the injuries. Then Meyer asked about the location. Schessler told him that due to the late hour and the women's emotional state, the witnesses could only state that they believed the incident had occurred on a straight portion of Farm to Market Road, 1485, between a beer joint and some kind of highway warning sign. They could not pinpoint it. This was a bombshell, because in public, Schessler would tell a very different story. In his 1998 book, The Cash-Landrum UFO Incident, Schessler wrote that the women led him to nearly the exact same location during separate site visits. He told the television program Unsolved Mysteries that the road had been heated to an extreme level, burned so badly it was visible to the naked eye. He told sightings that the flying machine had left marks on the road, so you knew exactly where it was. But in September of 1981, speaking to a state radiation inspector, he admitted the witnesses could not find the spot. Kurt Collins, a UFO researcher who spent years investigating the case, published the Texas Department of Health file on his blog, Blue Blurry Lines, in 2013. Collins concluded that if the location could not be verified, then the claims of scorched pavement, heated trees, and physical ground damage were unsupported. The foundation of the physical evidence began to crack, and there was more. The Bergstrom interview transcript, conducted on August 17, 1981, contained moments that did not fit the narrative. When Air Force Captain John Camp asked Betty and Vickie to sketch exactly how the words on the helicopters appeared, 7-year-old Colby interrupted. He asked if they meant the helicopter that had landed in Dayton. Vickie shushed him immediately. It was a small moment, but in that small moment, a child had nearly pulled the thread that would unravel the entire helicopter identification.
This is Tom Mackenzie. The government did not need to prove the women were lying. It only needed to prove one thing, that the machines they described were never there. When a $20 million lawsuit reaches a federal courtroom, the truth has to be more than a feeling. It has to be a fact you can show. And what the Cash-Landrum case was about to learn is that certainty, no matter how deeply held, is not the same thing as proof.
The lawsuit marched forward. Peter Gersten gathered testimony from officials across the military and scientific establishment. He filed motions. He deposed witnesses. He argued that the United States government had conducted a secret aerial test using an experimental craft, that the test had gone wrong, and that 23 military helicopters had been dispatched to manage the fallout. He asked for $20 million in damages for Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Colby Landrum. The government responded with silence and denial. NASA officials testified that the agency possessed no diamond-shaped aerial vehicles and had never conducted operations matching the witnesses' description. Air Force officials confirmed that no Air Force helicopters had been in the Dayton area on December 29, 1980. Army officials stated that while Army Chinooks did operate in Texas, none had been assigned to the location or time in question. Navy officials added their own denials, but the women had a witness. They had the pilot. The story of the Dayton helicopter pilot had spread through UFO circles as proof of military involvement. In April of 1981, Vickie had taken Colby to see the CH-47 that landed in their town. She had told the pilot about the encounter. She claimed he admitted he had been in the area checking on a UFO, in trouble, near Huffman. The name Huffman meant something. It was close to the encounter site. It was specific. And for years, believers pointed to this moment as the smoking gun. A military pilot had confessed. He knew. They all knew. But Kurt Collins discovered the truth. The pilot was not talking about the Cash-Landrum incident. He was talking about a separate report from July of 1977, more than 3 years earlier, in which a different unidentified craft had allegedly been seen near Huffman. When Vickie mentioned the UFO, the pilot assumed she meant the old case. When he realized she was talking about something else, he stopped talking and removed them from the aircraft. The confession was a misunderstanding. The smoking gun was a blank. On August 21st, 1986, United States District Court Judge Ross Sterling dismissed the case. The plaintiffs had been unable to provide evidence that helicopters belonging to the United States military were in the area on the night in question. The government did not possess any diamond-shaped aerial vehicles. There was no operation to admit to, no test gone wrong, no cover-up to expose. Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum walked out of the courtroom with nothing. The hallway was crowded with reporters who had come hoping for a bombshell. Instead, they got a dismissal. Peter Gersten told the press that the government had buried the truth. He promised to appeal. But the appeal never materialized. The case was closed. The file was sealed. And the women, who had arrived believing that justice was a matter of persistence, learned that persistence alone could not compel a government to admit what it denied. The dismissal was devastating. Betty had spent 6 years of her life on this case. She had traveled back and forth between Alabama and Texas. She had sat in deposition rooms and answered the same questions hundreds of times. She had allowed her medical records to be examined by strangers. She had believed, with absolute certainty, that the government would be forced to admit what it had done. Instead, a man in a black robe had told her that nothing happened, that the helicopters did not exist, that the craft did not exist, that her injuries, her hair loss, her hospitalizations, her pain were the result of something that had never occurred. Vickie was equally shattered, but her faith sustained her in a way that Betty's anger could not. Vickie believed that God had allowed her to see something holy, and that the government's denial was just another form of persecution. She told reporters outside the courthouse that she would keep fighting. She would keep telling the truth. She would never stop. The media did not walk away. Over the following years, the story was told and retold on national television. Vickie appeared on That's Incredible in 1981, hypnotized in front of a studio audience, recounting the encounter under trance. In 1989, she and Betty appeared on UFO Cover-Up, Live, hosted by Mike Farrell. In 1991, the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. In 1992, it appeared on Sightings. Each retelling added certainty. Each appearance cemented the narrative. John Schuessler published his book in 1998. It included medical records, interview transcripts, and photographs. It also omitted key conclusions and presented a location that Schessler had privately admitted could not be found. The book became the definitive account for believers. It was cited in documentaries, referenced in articles, and quoted by researchers who never checked the original sources. For 2 decades, it was the only comprehensive record of the case. And because it was the only record, its omissions became invisible. The legend was now larger than the evidence. And the legend had a life of its own.
By the time the lawsuit was dismissed, Betty Cash had already spent years telling her story to anyone who would listen. She believed the government had harmed her. She believed it with a ferocity that made doubt impossible. And when you believe something that deeply, the line between memory and conviction can start to blur. What we're about to walk through isn't an attempt to humiliate a sick woman or dismiss a frightening night. It's an attempt to understand what actually happened to 3 people on a dark road, and how the story they told became something much larger than the truth that supported it. The medical records are real. The investigative files are real. And they tell a different story than the one that made it onto television. Here is how the case comes apart. Not all at once, but in 4 cracks.
The first crack was medical. The records pointed away from radiation poisoning and towards something already in Betty's medical history: alopecia areata, an autoimmune condition diagnosed by skin biopsy and microscopic examination of the hair follicles. This was a laboratory finding, not a casual guess, and she had been diagnosed with it in 1978, 2 years before the encounter. The condition caused patches of hair to fall out, sometimes on one side of the scalp more than the other. It flared periodically. It was not caused by UFOs. Dr. Peter Rank, a radiologist who reviewed Betty's complete medical records at Schessler's request, wrote a detailed letter in 1982. He concluded that there were no signs of serious injury from the alleged incident. He also examined Vickie's cataract and determined it was likely a pre-existing condition. Schessler included most of Dr. Rank's letter in his 1998 book. He did not include that conclusion. The sunburned photographs that appeared on the April 1981 episode of That's Incredible showed discrete, round, rash-like marks on Betty's arms. Dr. Gary Posner, a skeptical physician who examined the footage, described them as looking exactly like patterns created by exposing skin through a garment containing circular cutouts, then subjecting the skin to sunlight or a sun lamp. These patterns were not mentioned in any hospital records. If doctors had documented them, Schessler chose not to share that detail. Vickie Landrum did not report hair loss or fingernail loss in the months immediately following the incident. She mentioned these symptoms for the first time 8 months later, during the Bergstrom interview. She never sought medical treatment for them. No photographs exist. No medical records support the claim. The second crack was physical. Russ Meyer had driven Farm to Market Road, 1485, with calibrated equipment and found nothing. No abnormal isotopes. No elevated radioactivity. No chemical contaminants. The state laboratory in Austin confirmed it. But the location itself was the deeper problem. Schessler had told Meyer in September 1981 that the witnesses could not pinpoint where the incident occurred. They could only say it happened somewhere on a straight stretch between a beer joint and a road sign. Schessler told the television program Unsolved Mysteries that the road had been burned so badly it was visible to the naked eye. He told sightings that the craft had left marks on the pavement, but when it mattered, when a state radiation inspector needed to verify the site, the witnesses could not find it. If the location was uncertain, then the claims of scorched pavement and heated trees had no foundation. The radiation theory collapses on basic physics. The symptoms reported would have required a dose of ionizing radiation so massive that all 3 witnesses would have been dead within days. They were not dead. Betty Cash lived 18 years. Vickie Landrum lived 27 years. Colby Landrum is still alive. The 3rd crack was mechanical. The United States Air Force did not operate twin-rotor CH-47 Chinook helicopters in 1980. Its rotary wing inventory consisted of single-rotor aircraft. Chinooks were flown by the Army, the Air National Guard, and some Navy units. The words United States Air Force, spelled out in full on the side of a Chinook, would not have appeared on any aircraft in the Air Force inventory. At the Bergstrom interview, Captain John Camp knew this immediately. He asked the women to sketch the words. He asked them to describe the font, the spacing, the color of the letters. Their descriptions were detailed and consistent. But they were describing something that did not exist in the branch they named. Dayton police officer Lamar Walker and his wife Marie claimed to have seen approximately 12 Chinook-type helicopters in the area on the same night. They did not report seeing a UFO. They did not report lights in the sky. They saw helicopters. In East Texas, near military training routes, seeing helicopters was not unusual. The 4th crack was memory itself. Colby's interruption during the drawing exercise suggests the family had discussed the helicopters extensively before the interview. When the boy asked if they meant the helicopter that had landed in Dayton, Vickie shushed him. The Dayton helicopter was a real, identifiable aircraft, not part of any secret operation. What likely happened is this. Betty, Vickie, and Colby saw something unusual on that December night. It may have been an aircraft landing light, a hot air balloon, a celestial mirage, or an experimental craft. They were frightened. The heat they felt may have been real, or it may have grown in the retelling. Every time they told the story, the details sharpened. The number of helicopters grew more certain. The markings became clearer. The memory, reinforced by years of discussion and legal preparation, became something as solid as fact. They developed genuine stress symptoms, and Betty developed genuine medical conditions that were already taking hold in her body. When they sought help and found none, they channeled their fear and frustration into a legal battle that required them to strengthen their story. And John Schuessler, a man who believed in extraterrestrial visitation before he ever heard the name Cash or Landrum, gave their story the architecture of a legend. He suppressed the Texas Health Department report. He omitted Dr. Rank's medical conclusions. He promoted a location he could not find. He built a case that felt irrefutable because it was built on faith, not on evidence. Maybe the Cash-Landrum incident was never really a story about a government cover-up. Maybe it was a story about something stranger. How belief can reshape memory, how fear can harden into testimony, and how one frightening night can become a legend. On December 29th, 1998, Betty Joyce Cash died at her home in Alabama. She was 69 years old. It was exactly 18 years to the day since she had stood on Farm to Market Road 1485 and watched a diamond of silver metal shoot flames into the piney woods. For conspiracy theorists, the date was proof. The government had finally silenced her. The radiation had caught up. The night had marked her, and the mark had lasted exactly 18 years. For her doctors, the date was a coincidence. Betty had heart disease, a history of surgery, and a body that had been failing for years. She died of heart failure, the same thing that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. After the lawsuit failed, Betty had moved to Alabama to be closer to her children. She lived quietly in a small house near Mobile. She worked part-time at a convenience store. She attended church on Sundays. She kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about the case, which she showed to anyone who expressed interest. Her health declined steadily. The heart surgery she had undergone before the incident left her with limited stamina, and the breast cancer diagnosis in the early 1990s took what little energy she had left. On December 28, 1998, she told her daughter that she felt tired. She went to bed early. She did not wake up. The coroner ruled natural causes, specifically congestive heart failure. There was no autopsy. There was no investigation, just a death certificate and a funeral and a headstone that read, Betty Joyce Cash, 1929 to 1998. The dates, exactly 18 years apart, became fodder for a new round of conspiracy theories. The truth, that Betty had heart disease, had been declining for years and died in her sleep on the eve of a bitter anniversary, could never compete with the darker story. The darker story was the one people wanted to hear. Betty Cash was a woman who had been frightened, then sick, then angry, then consumed by a single story she could not stop telling. She gave interviews. She went on television. She sat in courtrooms. She called senators and lawyers and NASA engineers. She spent the last 2 decades of her life trying to force the United States government to admit that it had harmed her, and she died without that admission. Whether the government actually harmed her is a question the evidence does not support. But her belief was real. Her suffering was real. Her fear was real. Vickie Landrum died on September 12, 2007, at the age of 83. She had never stopped believing that she had seen a sign from Jesus on that dark road, and that the military had been there to witness it. She told the story until the end of her life. Colby Landrum appeared on the television program UFO Hunters, Alien Fallout in 2009. He was no longer a child. He was a man in his 30s, still carrying the memory of a night when his grandmother had told him that Jesus would not hurt him, and the sky had filled with fire and helicopters. He did not claim to know what the object was. He only claimed to remember what he had felt. And in the end, feeling is what survives. The facts fade. The files gather dust. The witnesses pass on. But the fear, the awe, the certainty that something extraordinary happened on a dark road in East Texas, that remains. In the end, we may never know exactly what happened on that cold December night. But the human cost was real. The fear was real. And the story, true or false, became part of American folklore.
This is Tom Mackenzie. On December 29, 1980, something happened in the piney woods outside Dayton, Texas. 3 people saw it. Their bodies remembered it. Their lawyers fought for it. And their chronicler turned it into a legend that is still told today, long after the courts closed the file and the witnesses passed on. We may never know what hovered above those trees, but we know what belief can do to a life. We know what fear can do to a memory. And we know that sometimes the strangest thing in the sky is not a craft, or a weapon, or a cover-up. Maybe it was what came after, the human need to turn fear into meaning, and meaning into truth. This has been Unexplained History. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back with you next time.